The Duke of Stormont had come to the wedding to be seen, and he had chosen a pew near the back where he might be seen the least. And so, he was the only man in the church looking at the wrong sister when the whole edifice of the morning came crashing down. The bride stood at the altar in white silk gone faintly gray with old lace, her hands trembling around a bouquet of hothouse roses, and beside her the golden groom leaned not toward her but past her, toward the maid of honor, and Roderick understood a full 3 seconds before the rest of them what he was witnessing. He set down the order of service he had not read. He watched the young Viscount named Julian Ravenscar turn his handsome, weak face away from the woman he had sworn to marry and reach, instead for the woman who resembled her in every feature, and resembled her in nothing else. "I cannot," said Julian, and his voice carried the way that shallow voices always carried, pitched to be overheard. "Forgive me, I cannot. It is Cassandra I love. It has always been Cassandra." For a moment nobody in the packed church moved, and in that silence Roderick heard a small dry sound that he alone was near enough to place. It was the bride's breath leaving her. Lucinda Fairfax did not scream. She did not swoon, which was what the assembled gentry plainly expected of her and rather hoped for, since a swoon would give them somewhere to put their hands and their smelling salts and their delicious pity. She simply stood and looked at the man before her, and then at her sister, and the roses slipped from her fingers and struck the stone floor and scattered, and still she did not make a sound. Cassandra Fairfax made sound enough for both of them. She laughed, a bright rill of a laugh that she smothered too late behind her glove, and she took Julian's offered arm, and she lifted her chin with the serene cruelty of a woman who has wanted a thing so long she no longer troubles to hide the wanting. "Do not look at me so, sister," she said. "You never suited him. Everyone has always known it. I have only done what was honest." The whispering began then, a hiss that ran the length of the nave like wind through wheat, and the clergyman stood with his book open and his mouth ajar, and the mother of the brides, poor anxious Mrs. Fairfax, half rose from her pew with both hands pressed to her heart and no words at all in her, and Roderick watched it all with the cold, exact attention he gave to everything, and he thought with a clarity that surprised him, "They will devour her." He knew how it would go because he knew this society as a man knows the workings of a trap that has closed on him before. By nightfall the story would be told in 40 drawing-rooms, and in the telling, Lucinda would become not the wronged woman but the dull one, the plain twin, the girl so lacking in charm that her own betrothed had thrown her over at the very altar for her sister. It would follow her into every room she entered for the rest of her life. No man of standing would take a jilted bride whose humiliation had been enacted in front of half the county. She would go home to that thin, frightened mother and that ruined house, and she would grow old there, and the world would say she had deserved it, because the world always found a way to say the ruined had deserved it. Roderick knew this. He had been the ruined once in a fashion, and the world had said the same of him. He did not decide to stand. He was standing. He was aware of the murmur changing pitch as heads turned, aware that men who had spent years arranging never to catch his eye were catching it now, aware of the particular quality of a room's attention when the most feared man in it moves without invitation. The Duke of Stormont. They said he had killed his first wife, or as good as. They said the cold of Stormont Keep had frozen her to death by inches. They said he had hands that had done things and a heart that had never held anything. He let them say it. It kept them at a distance, and distance was the only comfort he had permitted himself in 5 years. Now he walked up the aisle through the wreckage of another man's promise, and the crowd drew back from him on either side as though he carried plague, and he stopped before Lucinda Fairfax, who lifted her eyes to his face without flinching, which almost no one did. She was not plain. This was the thing he had understood weeks ago at the assembly where he had first seen the 2 sisters and everyone else had seen only one. Cassandra dazzled the way a chandelier dazzled, all facets and no depth, and beside that glitter Lucinda had seemed, to the careless eye, to be a shadow. But Roderick's eye was not careless. He had watched the quiet sister that night attend an old deaf dowager whom everyone else avoided, bending close and patient and laughing at some small joke, and he had watched her feed a stray dog at the edge of the terrace when she thought herself unobserved, and he had thought, "That is a good face," and had been so unaccustomed to the thought that it had stayed with him for a fortnight like a splinter he could not find to draw out. "Miss Fairfax," he said now, and his voice in the ringing church was low, and it stopped the whispering as a hand laid flat upon a struck bell stops the sound. Her lips parted. Up close he could see what her stillness had cost. Her eyes were bright and enormous with the tears she was refusing to spend before these people, and a pulse beat wildly in her white throat, and yet she answered him steadily. "Your Grace." "You are acquainted with the terms of your situation," he said, because he did not know how to be gentle and would not insult her by pretending otherwise. "So am I. I will not waste your time or mine with soft words we neither of us have the stomach for. In 1 hour this county will have decided that you are unfit to be any man's wife. I am offering to make that decision a lie. Marry me, today, as I stand and as you stand." Somewhere behind him a woman gasped, and someone else said his name, and Cassandra's bright laugh cut off as though a door had shut on it. Julian Ravenscar had gone the color of tallow, but Roderick did not turn to enjoy it, though a colder part of him noted the sweetness of it distantly, the way a man notes good weather while attending to graver things. He kept his eyes on the woman before him. Lucinda looked at him for a long moment. He had expected refusal or hysteria or the vacant staring of a mind that has taken too hard a blow to reason. He had not expected her to say, with the ghost of something almost like grim humor moving under her ruin, "You would marry a woman your whole world believes to be worthless, to spite a man you have never met, before an altar still warm from her disgrace." Why? It was, he would think later, the first honest question anyone had asked him in years, and it deserved an honest answer, and he did not give her one, because the honest answer was, "I saw you feed the dog and it undid something in me," and he had no words for that and would not have trusted them if he had. "Because I please myself," he said instead, which was true as far as it went, "and because I am the one man in England whose reputation is proof against yours. No scandal can touch me that has not already touched me 100-fold. Marry me, and you step out of your ruin into the one place in this country where their opinions cannot follow. Refuse, and go home to your mother's house and be pitied to your grave. I do not think you are a woman who could bear to be pitied." Something crossed her face at that, quick as a bird's shadow. He had struck true, and he was not proud of it, but he had learned long ago that the truth was the only lever that ever moved anyone, and he was moving her toward the only door out of the room that would not close on her fingers. "My mother," she began, "will be provided for. I do not marry into poverty and leave the roots to rot. Say yes or no, Miss Fairfax. The county is watching, and its patience is not a thing I would rely upon." She turned her head once and looked at her sister, who stood upon the groom's arm with her triumph curdling on her lovely face into something Roderick recognized, because he had made a study of faces, as the beginning of a terrible envy. Cassandra had wanted to be the center of the morning. She had stolen a bridegroom to be the center of the morning. And now the most feared duke in 3 counties had walked past her, as though she were furniture, and offered his hand to the sister she had spent her whole life eclipsing. And every eye in the church that had been fixed upon Cassandra's triumph was fixed now upon Lucinda's rescue, and Roderick saw the exact instant the faithless twin understood that she had thrown away the sun to snatch a candle. Lucinda saw it too. He watched her see it, and whatever it woke in her, weariness or defiance or simple exhausted resolve, it turned her back to face him, and she drew a breath that shook only a little, and she said, "Yes." The clergyman, when Roderick turned upon him the full weight of his attention, discovered that he was after all in possession of the words. Banns had been read for the wrong couple, but the Duke of Stormont had come to that county with a special license folded in his breast pocket, procured a week before for reasons he had told no one and had scarcely admitted to himself, and when he laid it upon the open prayer book, the clergyman's hands trembled worse than the bride's had done. There was a flurry, an argument at the edges, Mrs. Fairfax weeping and being led to a seat, Julian Ravenscar trying to speak and finding no one willing to hear him. But the machinery of a wedding, once wound, is difficult to stop, and there was a groom, and there was a bride, and there was a license and a clergyman and a church full of the most avid witnesses in England, and it went forward. He married her among the fallen roses. He said the words in a voice that gave nothing away, and she said them in a voice that had steadied into a flat, brave calm. And when the moment came for a ring, he drew from his smallest finger the signet ring of the Dukes of Stormont. The ring his father had worn and his father's father, black stone cut with the falcon of his house, and it was far too large for her, and she closed her hand to keep it and looked up at him with those bright, dry eyes. And something passed between them that he could not have named, and would not for a long time try to. There was no kiss. He did not presume to it, and she did not offer, and he was glad of that later, that he had not begun their strange marriage with a thing taken. He offered his arm instead, and she laid her cold hand upon it, and he walked her back down the aisle through the gauntlet of the county's astonishment, past her sister's white face and her mother's tears, and the shallow young man who had thrown away a good woman and would spend a great many years understanding it. And he handed her up into his black carriage with the falcon on the door, and the horses took them out through the churchyard gate and away, north, toward Stormont, where he had not brought a living soul who mattered to him in 5 years, because for 5 years there had been no living soul who mattered. She sat across from him with her ruined bouquet left behind on the church floor, and his father's ring loose upon her finger, and her wedding gown gray with borrowed lace. And she looked out the window at the county rolling past, the county that had watched her broken and would now spend a decade retelling how the Duke of Stormont had picked her up out of the ashes, and after a long while she spoke without turning from the glass. "I do not know why you have done this," she said, "and I do not believe your reasons, and I am too tired today to pretend that I do. But I will keep your house, and I will not shame your name, and I will ask nothing of you that you have not already offered. I think that is a fair bargain for a woman with nothing to bring to it." "You bring more than you know," said Roderick, and was startled to have said it aloud, and looked out his own window so that she should not see whatever was in his face. And neither of them spoke again until the towers of Stormont rose gray and enormous against the failing light, and the broken bride came home to the house of the most feared man in England, and did not yet know that she had just done the only thing in 5 years that had made him afraid. Stormont Keep did not welcome its new mistress so much as tolerate her arrival, and Roderick, who had lived within its cold long enough to stop feeling it, found himself seeing the house afresh through the eyes of the woman he had brought into it, and was ashamed of what he saw. The great hall stood dim and unaired. Holland cloths shrouded half the furniture in the west rooms. Dust lay on the frames of his ancestors, and the fires were mean and grudging, and a smell of damp and disuse hung in the corridors like the memory of an illness. He had let the place die around him because he had wanted it dead, or had thought he did. Now his bride stood in the hall in her disgraced wedding silk and looked slowly around her at the ruin of a great house, and he braced for dismay, or worse, for tears. She said, "It is a beautiful house that has been left to grieve." Roderick had no answer for that, and so he made none, and Mrs. Pell came forward with her ring of keys and her long disapproving face to be presented to the woman she had already, he could see, decided to resent. Mrs. Pell had kept Stormont for 30 years, through his father's time and his own, and she had loved the first Duchess in her stern fashion and had never spoken of her since she died, and she looked upon Lucinda now with the flat hostility of the old servant who suspects a newcomer of designs. "Your Grace," she said, and made a curtsy so shallow it was nearly an insult, and Roderick opened his mouth to correct her tone. Lucinda spoke first. "Mrs. Pell, His Grace has told me you have kept this house faithfully for many years through hard seasons. I'm a stranger here and I know it, and I will not pretend I have any right to your regard yet, but I hope to earn it. Will you show me the linen presses tomorrow? I saw damp in the north passage, and I think if we do not see to it before winter we shall lose the tapestries in the long gallery, which would be a great pity, for they are very fine." It was so exactly the right thing to say and so plainly unrehearsed that Roderick saw the old woman's certainties waver. Mrs. Pell had expected a fine lady who would ring for chocolate and leave the house to rot. She had been handed instead a woman who had noticed the damp within 10 minutes of crossing the threshold and had grieved the tapestries before she had grieved herself. "The presses," said Mrs. Pell, thrown off her guard. "Yes, your grace, tomorrow." And she curtsied again deeper, without seeming to know that she did it. They did not dine together that first night. Roderick had a tray sent to her rooms, the best rooms, the ones that had been aired that morning by his hurried order, and he ate alone in the cavern of the dining hall as he had eaten alone for 5 years, and he found the solitude he had made a home of had gone strange to him, because 100 feet away through the cold stone corridors there was now a living woman who had said his house was grieving. He did not sleep. He stood a long while at his window looking north over the dark moor, and thought about the fact that he had married again, he who had sworn never to do it, and he examined the thing he had done from every angle as a man examines a wound to learn how deep it goes, and he could not find in himself the regret he had been so certain would come. The truth about his first wife was a thing he had told no one, because the telling required him to say aloud what he could not bear to have believed, and so he had let the county build its monstrous story in the silence he left them. They said cold Stormont had frozen Alina to death, that she had died of his cruelty, that a woman so lovely and so gay had withered under his hand until she took a fever one winter and had not troubled to fight it. The county liked this story. It was tidy, and it made him the villain, and villains were comfortable to have about because they explained things. The truth was neither tidy nor comfortable. The truth was that Alina had married him for Stormont and never for himself, that she had been in love the whole time with another man, and that on the night she died she had been riding, in a storm, to meet that man and go away with him, and her horse had gone down on the ice of the bridge, and she had drowned in the black water of the Moat River with her lover's letter in her bodice, and Roderick had pulled her out himself and found the letter and read it and understood. Kneeling in the freezing mud with his dead wife in his arms, that she had never once loved him and had died escaping him. He had buried her with honor. He had said nothing. He had let the county call him a murderer rather than let them call her false, because some cold, stubborn remnant of the thing he had felt for her would not permit her name to be dragged, even in death, even for the truth. And he had shut the doors of himself one by one and thought never to open them again. That a stranger in a gray wedding gown had, in a single afternoon, made him aware of every one of those shut doors, was a fact he distrusted profoundly and resolved to guard against. The slow thaw came not in a rush but in 100 small, unremarkable acts across the length of an autumn, and Roderick, watching, kept a kind of astonished ledger of them. Within a week the North Passage was dry, the damp traced to a cracked gutter no one had thought to mind, and the long gallery smelt of beeswax instead of mold. Within a fortnight the Holland cloths were coming off the furniture, room by room, and the fires burned honestly, and there were flowers in the hall, late chrysanthemums from the neglected garden that Lucinda had gone out in the cold to cut herself. The servants, whom he had never troubled to know as anything but function, began to have faces. There was a bootboy who had a stammer and a terror of the housekeeper, and Roderick came upon his wife one afternoon in the boot-room teaching the child, patiently, without condescension, how to draw a slow breath before a hard word, and the boy was speaking to her almost easily, and Roderick withdrew before either saw him and stood in the corridor with a feeling in his chest he had no name for and did not want. She never intruded upon him. That was the thing he had feared most, and it did not come. She had understood the terms of their bargain, and she kept them with a scrupulousness that was itself, he came slowly to see, a form of kindness. She did not fill his silences with chatter. She did not ask him where he went when he rode out alone across the moor for hours. She did not pry at the locked door of the east wing, though the servants would have told her what everyone in 3 counties knew, that it had been the first duchess's, and had not been opened since. She kept his house and mended its long grief and asked nothing, and Roderick, who had built his whole life around wanting nothing from anyone and giving nothing in return, discovered that being asked for nothing by a woman who noticed everything was a stranger torment than any demand could have been. They began to dine together in the third week, by no arrangement he could name. He had come down early one evening and found her already at the long table, and it had seemed absurd to send her away, and so they had eaten in near silence, and the next night she was there again, and the night after, and it became a thing that simply was. She was not a great talker, but she was a great noticer, and now and then she would say something about the day, some small true observation about the estate or the weather or a passage in a book from his library, and he found that he answered her in his short, cold way, and that the answers led to other things, and that an hour would pass and he would not have noticed it go, which had not happened to him in the company of another human being in longer than he could clearly remember. "You are not what they said you were," she told him one night, over the walnuts, in the frank way she had that still occasionally caught him off his guard. "And what did they say I was?" "A monster." She met his eyes as she said it without malice, only with a curious searching honesty. "A man who froze his wife to death and would as soon freeze another. I confess I was afraid that first night. I lay awake half of it. And then I have watched you 3 weeks, and I have seen you send half a year's rent to the widow of a tenant who died in the summer quietly, so that no one should know you did it, and I have seen you turn the whole household upside down to have my rooms aired before I ever arrived, and I have decided that whatever happened here, it was not what they say." Roderick set down the walnut he had not cracked. He could have deflected it. He had deflected everything for 5 years, and he was skilled at it, and the words to turn her away were on his tongue. Instead, he heard himself say into the candlelight, "What happened here is not a thing I speak of." "I know," she said. "I am not asking you to. I only wanted you to know that I do not believe them." And she rose and wished him good night, and left him alone with the guttering candles and the terrible unfamiliar warmth of having been believed by someone who had no reason to believe him. And he sat there a long time, and did not sleep that night either, but for a different cause. Winter came down hard off the moor. The roads closed with snow and Stormont drew into itself, and Roderick found that the drawing-in, which had for 5 years meant a deeper solitude, now meant its opposite. There was a woman in the house who filled it with small living warmths, who had coaxed the servants into something like a family, who sat across the fire from him in the evenings with her needlework or a book, and asked him sometimes to read aloud, which he had not done since he was a boy and did badly at first and then, under her quiet attention, less badly. He caught himself watching her hands. He caught himself, one gray afternoon, standing at the window watching her cross the snow-covered court below wrapped in a red cloak, her breath a plume, laughing at something the stammering bootboy had said, and he understood with a lurch of pure fear that he was no longer merely tolerating his marriage. He was living inside it. He had let her in through every one of the doors he had barred, and he had not even noticed the barring give way, and now she was everywhere in him, and he did not know how to want her without also knowing, with the cold certainty of a man who had learned it in freezing mud, that she did not and could not want him. For she had loved Julian Ravenscar. Roderick told himself this in the dark hours with the discipline of a penitent telling his beads. She had stood at an altar in white to marry a golden, foolish boy, and whatever that boy was, she had chosen him, had loved him enough to promise him her life, and no woman forgot such a thing in a single winter. Roderick was the door she had walked through to escape her ruin. He was the bargain, the cold, famous Duke, the man his own dead wife had fled across a frozen river to be quit of. He would not make the error twice. He would not let himself believe that a good woman could look at what he was and find it lovable, because he had believed that once of a leaner, and had knelt in the mud and learned the price of the belief. And so, as the winter deepened and the thaw in Lucinda's presence warmed every cold room of Stormont Keep, its master built new walls in secret behind his eyes, and told himself they were wisdom, and did not yet suspect how thoroughly the woman across his hearth was already at work, without design, dismantling them. The trouble with the Hart farm came to light because Lucinda kept the household books, and Lucinda, who had learned to watch because no one had ever watched her, could no more overlook a false column of figures than she could overlook damp in a north passage. Roderick had never troubled himself greatly with the accounts. He had a steward for the estate at large, a grave, capable man named Wickham whom he trusted, and beneath Wickham a bailiff for the outlying farms, a fellow named Coyle who had come to Stormont in the last year of Roderick's long grief, in the season when the master of the house had ceased to look closely at anything, and who had, it now emerged, made excellent use of a master who did not look. It was Lucinda who first grew still over the ledgers one January evening. Her finger paused upon a line, and when Roderick asked her what she saw she did not answer at once, which was itself unlike her, and then she said, carefully, "Your Grace, may I ask you a question about the heart tenancy, and will you not laugh at me if the question is foolish? For I am new to the running of an estate and may have it all wrong." "I have never yet heard you say a foolish thing," said Roderick, "and I do not expect to begin tonight. Ask." "The Harts have farmed the low meadow these 40 years, it says here, father and son, and these 3 seasons past their rent has risen by a third, and their arrears have grown, and there is a note in Mr. Coyle's hand recommending they be turned off at Lady Day for a more solvent tenant. But the yield from the low meadow has not fallen. I have the figures here. It is the best barley land on the estate. A farm that pays its rent for 40 years does not fall into ruin in 3 good seasons unless something has changed, and the only thing I can find that has changed is Mr. Coyle. Their rent goes up, their arrears grow, and yet the land yields as it always did. Where is the barley going, Roderick? For it is not going into the Hart's rent, and it is not, by these books, going into yours." Roderick came round the table and stood over the ledger, and looked where her finger pointed, and felt the slow, cold anger of a man shown a thing he ought to have seen himself. She was right. Once she had drawn the line for him, he could not unsee it. A bailiff who set the rents and collected them and reported the arrears, over a master too sunk in his own dark to check the figures, could skim a fortune off a dozen farms and blame the shortfall on the tenants, and turn off the honest ones who complained, and bring in men of his own choosing who would pay him a private consideration to keep their leases, and no one would be the wiser so long as the Duke did not look. It was an old dishonesty and a common one, and it flourished in exactly the soil Roderick had given it, which was neglect. "You have found me a thief in my own house," he said slowly, "and worse, you have found me the author of him, for I made the dark he grew in. How long have you known?" "I have suspected a fortnight. I did not speak until I was sure, for it is a grave thing to accuse a man of, and I would not have you turn off an honest servant on a new wife's fancy. But I am sure now, and there is worse than figures in it. I rode down to the low meadow yesterday." "You rode to the Hart farm?" "I did. I wished to see the land the figures spoke of and the people. Roderick, the old man, is dying. Hart the elder. He has a wasting cough, and no physician has been near him because they cannot pay one, because their little all goes to a rent that has been trebled by a thief, and his wife sat by his bed and would not meet my eyes because she thought I had come, being the new duchess, to hurry them off the land her husband was dying on, that his father farmed before him. She curtsied to me, that poor frightened woman, and thanked me for my condescension in coming, and I could have wept. They think you a monster, Roderick. They think you have set your bailiff to squeeze them because you are the cold, cruel Duke the county says you are, and they do not know that you have never seen a farthing of what has been squeezed, that it has all gone into Coyle's pocket while your name took the blame." Roderick stood very still in the candlelight. This was the thing, he would think later, that changed the shape of his marriage more than any tender word could have done, for it showed him what she was for, and what he might be with her, in a way the pleasant evenings by the fire had only hinted. He had let his whole estate fall into a neglect that mirrored the neglect of his own heart, and he had let his name become a byword for a cruelty he had never committed, first over a leaner and now over a dying farmer he had never met. And this woman had come into his ruined life and had begun, quietly and without reproach, to set every part of it right, the damp and the servants and the tapestries and now the very justice of his lands. She had found the thief he had made. She had ridden out in the cold to sit by the bed of a dying man his own carelessness was killing. And she had brought it to him not with accusation, but with that careful, frightened courtesy of hers, asking whether she might put a question, whether he would not laugh at her, as though she feared even now that the cold Duke might turn on her for the impertinence of caring. "We will ride to the Hart farm in the morning," he said, "you and I together, and we will send a physician tonight, at once, my own physician from the village, and the bill is mine and no word of it to the Harts. And on Monday I will have Mr. Coyle's books, all of them, every farm, and I will have Wickham go through them with me line by line. And if it is as you say, and I do not doubt you, then Mr. Coyle will answer for it to the fullest the law allows, and every farthing he has taken will be restored to the tenants he took it from, and the Hart's rent will be set back to what it was, and their arrears struck off entire, for the arrears are Coyle's crime and not their debt." He paused and looked at her, and something in his cold face was working. "Thank you," he said with difficulty, for he was not a man practiced in the saying of it. "I have been asleep in my own house for 5 years. You are waking it up around me, room by room, and I find I do not know how to thank you as the thing deserves." "You have just thanked me exactly as it deserves," said Lucinda, "by believing me on the instant and by thinking first of the physician. A great many men would have thought first of their own dignity, of how it looked to have been so cheated, and would have delayed the physician a day to save their pride. You did not. That is worth more to me than any speech, Roderick. It tells me what you are." They rode out at first light over the frozen fields, and Roderick watched his wife on horseback in her red cloak against the white land, and thought that he had never in his life ridden out with anyone toward a common purpose, that he had done everything alone for so long that the simple companionship of a shared errand struck him as almost unbearably sweet. At the Hart farm the physician had been and gone in the night, and the old man was easier, and the wife, learning that the Duke and Duchess were at her door, came out trembling and dropped a curtsy into the frozen mud, and Roderick, getting down from his horse, did a thing that he had not planned and that surprised him as much as anyone, which was to take the frightened woman's chapped hand in his own and tell her plainly that a wrong had been done her house in his name and without his knowledge, that it would be set right that week entire, that her rent was restored and her arrears forgiven and her husband's physician his own charge for as long as the illness lasted, and that no Hart would be turned off Stormont land while he was its master, this year or any year, and she might tell her husband so, that he might mend the easier for knowing his people were safe. The woman wept. She could not speak, but she wept, and she pressed the Duke's hand between both of hers and looked from him to the Duchess as though a story she had believed her whole life had turned inside out before her eyes, and Roderick, riding home, was silent a long while, and then he said, "They have feared me for years. That woman has taught her frightened and hidden the children when my carriage passed, because the county told her I was a devil. And it was true in a way, though not the way they meant. I was not cruel, I was worse. I was absent. I let my own house be run by a thief and my own people be ground down in my name because I could not be troubled to lift my head out of my grief and look at them. That is its own kind of cruelty, Lucinda, perhaps the commoner kind, the cruelty of the man who simply does not look." "And you are looking now," she said gently. "You have made it impossible not to. You look at everything and everyone, and I find I cannot sit beside a woman who sees so much and go on seeing nothing. It shames me out of my blindness." He was quiet again, and then, in the tone of a man making a confession he has resolved upon in advance, he said, "There is a thing I have not told you about how the county came to think me a monster in the first place, before ever there was a Coyle or a Hart, about my first wife. I do not speak of it. But I find I wish you to know it, in your own time, when there is time, for I do not like that you should live in this house and hear only the county's version, as the Harts heard only the county's version of the rents. I have let too many people believe the wrong story about me because it was easier than telling the right one. I do not want you to be one of them." "Then tell me when you are ready," said Lucinda, "and not before, and not because you feel you owe me an accounting, for you owe me none. But I will be glad to know the true thing, Roderick, whenever you wish me to, for I would rather know you than the county's rumor of you. I married the man, not the rumor. He did not tell her that day. But the door of it had opened, and they both knew it had opened, and they rode home over the white fields not touching, and yet, Roderick felt, more nearly joined than many a couple who touched a great deal, and the matter of Coil went forward as he had promised, and it was as bad as Lucinda had found and worse, spread over 9 farms in 3 years, and Wickham was appalled and Coil, confronted, blustered and then broke and then fled, and the law was set after him. And every farthing that could be traced was restored, and the county, which loved a scandal above all things, had a new one to chew. Only this scandal ran the wrong way for the tellers, for it was the story of a duke who had discovered a thief in his house and had ridden out in person to make restitution to a dying tenant. And no matter how the county tried to bend the tale to its old shape, the shape would not bend, because the Harts and 8 other farms told it too, and told it with tears. And a story told with tears by the people who lived it is stronger than any drawing-room's malice. So the whisper began to change, that winter, before ever the great reckoning at the inn. It began in the cottages and the field lanes and worked its slow way up. Cold Stormont, the murderer, the devil of the moor, had a young wife now, the jilted twin the county had pitied, and between them, the whisper said, they had cleaned out a thief and saved a dying man's farm, and the duke had held a frightened woman's hand in the mud and called her his people, and perhaps, the cottages said to one another over their fires, perhaps he was never the devil after all. Perhaps it was only that he had grieved and gone dark, and here was a girl who had lit him up again. The drawing-rooms were slower. The drawing-rooms had invested 5 years in the story of the murderer and did not care to write it off. But the ground had shifted, and Roderick felt it shift, and knew whose doing it was, and looked at his wife across the supper table with a feeling that was no longer merely gratitude, and was not yet a thing he dared to name, and kept his silence about it, and told himself the silence was patience, and did not yet know how nearly it would cost him everything. The drawing-rooms would not be conquered from the cottages, and Roderick knew it, and so did Lucinda, and it was Lucinda who proposed the thing that neither of them relished, and both of them saw must be done, which was that the Duke and Duchess of Stormont should open the great house and receive the county in the flesh, and let it look its fill. They tell stories about us because we are shut away, and they may say what they please of a shut door, she said. A dinner will not silence them, but it will make them say it to my face or not at all, and there is a kind of person who is very brave against a closed door and very meek across a dinner table, and I have known that kind all my life, being the twin they whispered about. Let them come and look at me and find I do not have horns. It is harder to pity a woman who pours your tea and asks after your gout than it is to pity a rumor. She said it lightly, but Roderick, who read her now as easily as print, saw what it cost her to propose it, for it meant walking back into a room full of the very people who had watched her broken at the altar, and offering them her hand and smiling, and giving them nothing to feed on. You need not do this, he said. I have lived shut away 5 years and taken no harm from the county's talk. I can shut you away as safely. You have taken a great deal of harm from it, she said. You have simply grown so used to the wound that you no longer feel it bleed. I will not have you called a murderer in every parlor in the county for the rest of your life because it is easier than a dinner. And I will not hide, Roderick. I hid my whole girlhood, made myself small and quiet and invisible so that Cassandra might shine, and it did not save me from the altar. I am done with hiding. If they mean to talk of me, let them do it having met me. I would rather be despised for what I am than pitied for what they imagine me. So the great house was opened, that it had not been in 5 years, and Mrs. Pell fell upon the preparations with a grim ferocity that told Roderick more than any words how thoroughly the old woman had come to take his wife's part. For Mrs. Pell meant that no soul crossing the Stormont threshold should find one cobweb or one tarnished spoon to carry home as gossip, and the house was scoured and aired and lit, and set with the old plate that had not seen daylight since the first Duchess died. And on the appointed evening, the carriages of the county came up the long avenue through the winter dark to the blazing house, drawn by curiosity as much as by any wish to be civil, for half of them had come, Roderick knew, precisely to look at the jilted bride in her stolen splendor and go home, and say she had not deserved it. He watched his wife receive them. He stationed himself where he could watch, and he watched with the cold, exact attention he gave to everything ready, though he did not fully own it to himself, to end the evening and empty his house at the first cruelty offered her. It was not offered, or not openly. Lucinda received the county in the great hall in a gown of dark blue that Mrs. Pell had contrived, with the falcon signet on a ribbon at her throat for want of any other ducal jewel, and she was not brilliant, was not dazzling, made no attempt to be, for she was not Cassandra and had the wisdom never to try to be. She was instead quiet and warm and wholly self-possessed, and she remembered every name, and asked the dull questions that put dull people at their ease, and drew out the shy and deflected the malicious with a gentle deafness to their barbs that left them nothing to strike against. And Roderick, watching, understood that he was seeing a mastery of a kind he had never possessed and never would, the mastery of a woman who had spent a lifetime on the edges of rooms studying the people at their centers, and who knew, therefore, exactly how a room worked, and could turn it, without ever seeming to try, from a court assembled to judge her into a company charmed in spite of itself. There was one bad moment. A Lady Marchmont, a great dowager of the county, sharp-tongued and much feared in her own sphere, who had known the first Duchess and had come, it was plain, spoiling for a chance to wound, said loudly over the soup, in the false innocent voice such women use, that it must be a strange thing for the new Duchess to keep house where a former one had died so young and so sadly, and that she hoped her Grace did not find Stormont cold, for they did say, did they not, that the last one had found it very cold indeed. It was a cruel stroke, aimed at Lucinda and at Roderick both, meant to raise the ghost of the murdered wife at his own table before his new one, and the table went silent, and Roderick felt the old ice start up his spine, and opened his mouth to freeze the woman where she sat. Lucinda spoke first, and gently, and disarmed the whole thrust with a grace that left Roderick and the table and Lady Marchmont herself with nothing to say. "I find Stormont the warmest house I have ever lived in, Lady Marchmont," she said, "though I grant you it did not always look so, for it had been let grow chill during a long grief, as any house will, and I have had the happy work of warming it. As for the lady who kept it before me, I think of her often and kindly, for she died young, which is the saddest thing that can befall anyone, and I hope I keep her house in a way she would not be ashamed of. It seems to me a poor way to honor the dead, to make their memory a weapon at a living woman's table. I would rather honor her by loving the house she loved. Will you take more of the soup? The cook has surpassed herself, and I should hate for it to grow cold, for cold soup, we are agreed, is a melancholy thing." There was a beat of silence, and then, from somewhere down the table, a bark of laughter quickly stifled, for the sharpest dowager in 3 counties had been answered and turned and offered soup all in a breath, and had been made, gently, to look the churl she was, and the county, which respected nothing so much as a stroke well parried, could not help but relish it. Lady Marchmont, to her credit, was old enough and shrewd enough to know when she had been bested, and she took the soup, and looked at the young Duchess with a new and grudging attention, and before the evening was out she had drawn Lucinda aside and talked with her a full half-hour, and went home. Roderick heard afterward, telling everyone who would listen that the new Duchess of Stormont was a young woman of the most remarkable sense and breeding, and that the county had been unjust to her, and that she for one meant to say so wherever the subject arose. And as Lady Marchmont's word was law in a certain powerful quarter, the drawing-rooms began at last, grudging and slow, to follow where the cottages had led. Roderick came to his wife late that night, when the last carriage had rattled away down the avenue, and the great house was quiet, and the servants gone to their beds, and he found her in the emptied hall among the guttering candles, sitting all alone in a great chair with her slippers off and her feet tucked under her like a girl, worn out and unguarded, and the sight of her so undid him that he stood a moment in the doorway unable to go on. "You were magnificent," he said at last, coming to her. "I have watched that woman terrify the county for 30 years, and you handed her a bowl of soup and she went home your champion. I could not have done it. I would have frozen her and made a mortal enemy and confirmed every rumor. You warmed her instead and made a friend and unmade the rumor. I do not know how you do it. I do it because I was afraid of women like Lady Marchmont my whole life, said Lucinda tiredly, and a person who has been afraid of a thing long enough comes to understand it very well. She is not cruel, Roderick, or not only cruel. She is old and was beautiful once, and is not looked at any longer, and she says sharp things because a sharp thing gets a person looked at when nothing else will. I know that feeling from the inside. I spent a girlhood being unlooked at. I could have grown into a Lady Marchmont very easily, or she stopped. Or a Cassandra, said Roderick quietly. Lucinda was silent a moment. Yes, she said, or a Cassandra. It is a near thing sometimes which way a person turns when they have been made to feel small. Some turn cruel to be felt, and some turn kind because they know exactly how the small feel and cannot bear to add to it. I do not take much credit for being the second kind. It might as easily have been the other. She looked up at him, exhausted and honest in the candlelight. That is why I could not leave the hearts to their fear, and why I could not freeze Lady Marchmont though she deserved freezing. I know too well what it is to be on the wrong side of a cold room. I would not put anyone there if I could help it, not even the people who put me there. Roderick looked down at her a long moment, and the thing he had been refusing to name to himself, since the terrace and the stray dog, rose up in him with such force that he had to turn away from it, for he did not trust his face. He thought, she nearly told me tonight what she is, the whole of it, and I nearly told her what I am. And one of these nights the nearly will become the thing itself, and I am terrified of it, because if I tell her and she does not answer it, I will have handed my whole heart to a woman who married me to escape her ruin and stayed for the bargain's sake, and I do not think I would survive it a second time. And so, being a coward and calling it patience, he did not say it. He said instead, "It grows late and you are worn through and you have conquered the county single-handed and earned your rest. Go up. I will see the candles out." And she rose and touched his sleeve in passing lightly, in the gesture that had become theirs, and went up the great stair. And Roderick stood alone in the emptied hall snuffing the candles one by one, and with each one the great room grew darker, and he thought, snuffing them, that he was doing to his own heart exactly this, putting out one small light after another for fear of what might be seen by their glow, and that a man could stand a long time in a fine warm house he had let go dark. Telling himself it was patience, until the day came that the darkness was tested and found to be, after all, only fear. And he did not know, snuffing the last candle and climbing the stair alone, how soon that day was coming, nor down what road, nor in whose bright envious face it would arrive. The first crack in his careful walls came through the locked door of the east wing, and it was Lucinda who found the key, though she had never once gone looking for it. It happened in the deep of January. A storm had brought down a length of the roof over the disused wing, and water was coming in, and there was nothing for it but to open the shut rooms and see the damage, and Roderick, who had not crossed that threshold in 5 years, stood at the head of the passage with the cold key in his hand and could not make himself turn it. Lucinda was beside him. She had come because a roof was a roof and the mistress of a house saw to its fabric, and she had not known, until she saw his face, whose rooms these were. He watched her understand. He watched her almost withdraw, out of the delicacy that never failed her. And then he watched her choose to stay, and put her hand not upon the door but upon his sleeve lightly and say nothing at all, and it was the nothing that undid him, and he turned the key. The rooms beyond were a museum of a dead woman's vanished gaiety, and going through them by lamplight with the snow blowing in through the broken roof, Roderick found that he could not keep his silence whole. Perhaps it was the lamplight, or the storm, or 5 years of a thing pressed down too long. Perhaps it was only that Lucinda asked nothing, and it is easier to speak into a silence that makes no demands. He told her. Not all of it, not at first, but the shape of it. That Eleanor had not loved him, that she had died fleeing him, that the county's monstrous story was a lie he had let stand to shield a woman who had never spared a thought to shield him. He heard his own voice go on in the cold, saying things he had believed he would carry unspoken to his grave, and when he had done he stood with the lamp in his hand and waited for the pity he dreaded, or the recoil, or the swift female recalculation of a woman learning that her husband had been so thoroughly unloved. Lucinda did not pity him. She stood among the ruin of Alina's rooms with the snow whitening her dark hair, and she looked at him with a fierce, bright anger that was not for him at all, and she said, "She had a good man and a great house and your name to shield her, and she flung all three into a river to chase a letter. And you have spent 5 years letting them call you her murderer so that no one should speak ill of her." Her voice shook. "You foolish, honorable man. You have grieved for someone who did not deserve 1 hour of it." "She was my wife," he said. "And she did not love you, and you knew it, and you covered her shame with your own name anyway and asked nothing." Lucinda's eyes were very bright. "You keep doing that. You did it for her, and you did it for me in that church in front of all those people. You pick up what is broken and you shield it and you ask nothing back, and you have decided that this is all you are fit for, to be the wall other people hide behind. And no one in your whole life has ever once stood in front of you." Roderick could not speak. No one had ever seen him. That was the whole of it, laid bare in a cold, ruined room. No one had ever once seen him, and this woman had walked into his life out of the wreckage of her own and had seen him entire in a single winter, and was standing now in the falling snow being angry on his behalf, which no living soul had ever done. He wanted, with a violence that frightened him, to close the distance between them. He did not. Alina's ghost stood in that room, and the frozen river, and the letter, and the 5 years of learned certainty that he was not a thing that could be loved, and they held him where he stood. But something had shifted that could not be shifted back, and they both knew it, and they went out of the east wing together and locked the door on Alina for the last time, and did not speak of it again, and everything between them was different. That was the false dawn. Roderick would name it so afterward, with the bitter precision of a man cataloguing his own folly. For a space of some weeks after the night of the East Wing, Stormont Keep held a happiness so unfamiliar to its master that he mistrusted it even as he warmed himself at it. They rode out together when the weather softened. She beat him at chess and laughed at his affront. He found himself telling her things, small things, the history of the falcon on his ring, the boyhood he had spent half-wild on the moor, and she gave him her own in return, the long years of being the plain twin, the mother who had staked everything on Cassandra's beauty and had looked at the quieter daughter as one looks at a debt. "I was invisible," she told him once by the fire, "and I made a virtue of it because it was that or despair. I learned to watch since no one watched me. I think it is why I saw the damp so quickly," she smiled, "and why I saw you." He nearly told her that night. The words rose in him, terrible and shining, that he had watched her feed a dog at an assembly and had never after got her out of his mind, that he had bought a special license a week before her wedding without letting himself ask why, that she was not the door out of his solitude but the whole warm country beyond it. The words were in his mouth. And then the old cold voice, the one that had learned its lesson in the river, said, "She loved Julian Ravenscar. She will look at you with kindness because she is kind, and you will take it for more, and you will lay your whole heart in her hands, and one night you will find her gone across the ice." And the words died, and he wished her good night instead, and saw something flicker and fade in her face that he was too much a coward that night to read. The reversal came from the south, as such things do, along the thawing roads, in the persons of the very people Roderick had ridden away from at the altar. Cassandra Fairfax, now Cassandra Ravenscar, had discovered in 6 months of marriage that a man who will betray one sister at an altar is not a man made faithful by the switch of brides, and that a viscount's income does not stretch to a vain woman's wants, and that the triumph of stealing a groom curdles quickly when the world's attention, which she had committed the theft to capture, turns instead to the sister she had ruined. For the county talked of nothing but Lucinda now. The broken bride had become the Duchess of Stormont. The plain twin had risen higher than any woman in 3 counties, mistress of the greatest house and wife of its most feared lord, and the stories that came south told of a marriage that had against all expectation warmed, of a duke seen to smile, of a duchess beloved by her servants, and turning the dead house of Stormont back to life. And Cassandra, who had built her whole self upon being the one that was looked at, found the looking had moved to her sister, and could not endure it. She came to Stormont in a hired carriage with her husband and a trunk and a story of wishing reconciliation, and Roderick, watching her step down into his court in a gown a little too fine for her means and her lovely face composed into an expression of sisterly sorrow, knew her for exactly what she was within the first minute, because he had made a study of faces and hers was not a difficult text. She had come to get something back. He did not yet know what, but he knew the wanting when he saw it, and he set himself to watch. Lucinda received her sister with a composure that cost her, Roderick could see, a great deal. There was old pain in that house between the two women, a lifetime of it, and Cassandra worked upon it with a delicacy that would have deceived anyone who loved her less warily than Roderick had already, without quite admitting it, come to love her sister. Cassandra wept and asked forgiveness. She praised the house and the Duchess's happiness with a wide, bright envy poorly hidden under her words. She was charming to Roderick, more than charming, turning upon him the full battery of the beauty that had toppled a weaker man at an altar, and he received it with a cold courtesy that he watched her fail to understand, because it had never before in her life failed to work. And Julian Ravenscar, the Golden Fool, followed his wife's lead and made himself agreeable, and watched Lucinda across the dinner table with a look Roderick did not like at all, a slow, dawning look, the look of a man who has thrown away a coin and only now, seeing it spent by a richer hand, understands its worth. Roderick saw that look and felt the old cold close over his heart like river ice. There it was, the thing he had braced for since the altar. The golden boy she had loved, sitting at his table, wanting her back now that she was a duchess, and Lucinda gracious and gentle across the candlelight, and Roderick could not read her face, could not tell what the sight of Julian Ravenscar woke in the woman who had once stood in white to marry him, and the not knowing was a torment more exact than any certainty. They stayed a week. Roderick, who had ordered them gone within a day in his heart, found he could not evict his wife's only sister without a cruelty that would have been Lucinda's to bear, and so he endured them and watched, and the watching poisoned him by degrees. He saw Cassandra draw Lucinda into long private talks and saw his wife emerge from them troubled and quiet. He saw Julian contrive to be where Lucinda was in the gallery in the garden, and once, coming upon them unseen, he saw the young man take Lucinda's hand and speak to her low and urgent, and saw Lucinda pull the hand away, but not, he thought in the black country behind his eyes, quickly enough, and he turned and walked out into the snow before he could hear what words had passed, because he did not trust himself to hear them and go on being a civilized man. That night Cassandra found Roderick alone in his library, which he understood at once she had arranged, and she sat down uninvited by his fire, and turned her lovely ruined innocent face up to his and told him, with every appearance of a sister's reluctant grief, the thing she had come north to plant. "I must speak to you, your grace," she said, "though it wounds me, for I love my sister, but you have been so good to her, and it is not right that you should be deceived. Lucinda married you to spite Julian. She has never stopped loving him. She told me so herself this very week, weeping. She thinks of nothing but him. She married you for your name and your house, to punish the man who left her, and every kindness she shows you is a performance, and I could not sleep another night under your roof and let so honorable a man be so cruelly used." She let a tear fall beautifully. "I am sorry. I could not bear for you not to know." Roderick stood with his back to the fire and looked at his sister-in-law for a long moment, and every rational faculty he possessed told him the woman was lying, that this was the exact stroke of a jealous creature come to poison a happiness she could not share. He knew it, and it did not matter that he knew it, because the poison did not need to be believed to work. It needed only to name the thing he already, in the oldest and coldest chamber of his heart, feared to be true. She married you for your name and your house. She has never stopped loving him. It was Aline's letter read aloud in a new voice. It was the river and the ice. It was the one story his whole broken history had taught him to believe, and Cassandra had known, with the low cunning of the envious, exactly which wound to press. He said coldly that he thanked her for her concern and would trouble her for no more of it, and he showed her from the room. But the ice had closed over him again, and when Lucinda came to him that night, troubled, wanting to speak, wanting he thought to tell him some true thing about her sister's visit, he met her with the flat cold courtesy of the man he had been before she came, and he saw the confusion and then the hurt cross her face, and he did not stop it, because the wall was back up between him and the world, and behind it he was safe, and behind it he was alone. And he had chosen the aloneness the way a wounded animal chooses the dark. The days of that visit were the longest Roderick had passed since the year Elinor died, and he passed them at a slow torment of his own devising, watching and misreading, and the whole of the ruin that came after could be traced, he knew afterward, to the fact that he watched from behind a wall and drew his conclusions there, in the cold, alone, instead of once crossing the room to ask. Cassandra worked upon the house like water upon stone, everywhere and patiently, and with the appearance of doing nothing at all. She flattered Mrs. Pell and was rebuffed, for the old housekeeper had taken Lucinda's measure and Cassandra's both, and was proof against the one and disgusted by the other. But where the flattery of the servants failed, the sowing of small doubts did better, for Cassandra had a genius for the poison aside, the sisterly confidence drop where a maid might overhear, the sigh over how changed poor Lucinda was, how she had married in haste and grief, how she must surely regret dear Julian still, for who could forget a first love? Roderick did not hear these himself. He heard the wake of them, the way the household grew subtly uneasy across that week, the way a servant's eye slid from him, and he read the unease as confirmation of the thing Cassandra was at that very moment manufacturing, which is precisely how such poison is meant to work, feeding the fear it pretends merely to report. And Julian. Roderick came to loathe Julian Ravenscar that week with a cold completeness that surprised him, for he had thought the young man beneath his notice, and found instead that a weak man given the run of one's house and the pursuit of one's wife is a very hard thing to remain above. Julian had arrived shallow and departed shallow, but in between he had discovered, with the slow greed of his kind, that the woman he had thrown away at an altar was now a duchess, mistress of a house that made his own seem a cottage, beloved and respected where he had made her pitied, and something in the golden fool could not bear it. He had wanted Cassandra's dazzle when Cassandra dazzled. Now he looked at Lucinda's quiet and saw, too late, the worth of what he had spurned, and being a man who had never in his life denied himself a wanting, he set about, clumsily, to get it back, or at least to disturb it, for even a weak man can take a bitter pleasure in troubling a peace he cannot share. Roderick saw him contrive his little meetings, and each one turned the ice in him a degree colder, because he watched them from a distance and could not hear, and a thing watched from a distance and not heard becomes whatever the watcher most fears. He saw Julian find Lucinda in the long gallery and bend close. He saw him waylay her on the stair. And on the last full day of the visit, walking out to the stables in the raw afternoon, Roderick came round the yew hedge of the winter garden and saw, across 40 feet of frost-stiffened lawn, Julian Ravenscar take his wife's 2 hands and hold them and speak to her low and urgent with his handsome weak face full of pleading, and Roderick stopped dead behind the hedge, and every drop of blood in him turned to river water. He could not hear them, that was the thing. He stood behind the yew and he could not hear a word, and so his fear supplied the words, and his fear had 5 years of practice and supplied them cruelly. He saw Julian speak. He saw Lucinda go still, her head bowed. He turned before he could see the end of it, and walked back the way he had come with the ice closed over his heart. And he did not stay to see Lucinda draw her hands out of Julian's grip, did not stay to hear her tell the young man, in a voice that shook with anger and not with love, exactly what she thought of a man who would pursue his own wife's sister under that sister's husband's roof, exactly how little she had ever truly loved him, and how completely she had ceased even to respect him. That she would not cross a room for him were he the last man breathing, that she had married a better man than Julian could imagine being and loved him more than Julian was capable of understanding. He did not hear it, but Mrs. Pell heard it. For Mrs. Pell had been cutting the last of the winter greens beyond the far hedge, unseen by any of them, and Mrs. Pell heard the whole of it, every word, the young Viscount's pleading and the Duchess's cold, clean refusal, and Mrs. Pell stood very still among the frostbitten kale with her heart full, and carried the knowledge away, and did not speak of it, for it was not her place to speak of it unasked. And so it came about that the one witness who could have told Roderick the truth of the garden held her peace, waiting to be asked, and Roderick, too proud and too frightened to ask anyone anything, did not ask her, and carried instead his own poisoned version of a scene he had fled before its end. And the two knowledges, the true and the false, went their separate ways through the cold house toward the reckoning that would one day bring them crashing together in a shut library. That night at dinner Roderick was colder than he had been in a year, and Lucinda, who did not know he had seen anything at all, felt the cold and did not understand it and grew quiet under it, and Cassandra, who missed nothing that served her, saw the cold and the quiet and the distance between the two of them, and understood that her week's work had taken, and smiled behind her glass, and resolved to strike the finishing blow before she left. Roderick watched her smile and did not read it, being wholly absorbed in his own wound. He watched Lucinda be quiet and read it as guilt. He watched Julian be subdued, and read it as a lover thwarted rather than a fool rebuked. Every single thing he saw that night he read exactly backward, because he was reading it through Cassandra's ground lens, and through the older lens of Aline and the river, and there is no man so blind as the one who has decided in advance what he is going to see. It was later that same night that Cassandra found him in the library, and told him the lie that Lucinda had married him to spite Julian and loved the young man still. And Roderick, having spent the week watching a garden he could not hear and reading a wife he had decided to mistrust, was soil so perfectly prepared for that seed that it took root in an instant and could not afterward be pulled up by any reason, only by the truth. And the truth was locked for now in an old housekeeper's silence, and a dying bailiff's ledgers, and a duchess's wounded heart, and would not come out until it was very nearly too late. Lucinda came to him after Cassandra had gone up. He was still in the library, staring into the fire with the poison working in him, and she came in troubled and uncertain, having felt his cold all evening and wanting. He understood too late to warn him of her sister, to tell him what Cassandra had been at all week, to put into his hands the truth that would have armored him against exactly the lie he had just swallowed whole. She got no further than his name. "Roderick, I must speak to you of Cassandra, she has been," and he cut her off with a courtesy so cold it was worse than any blow, told her the hour was late and his head ached and they would speak in the morning, and turned his face back to the fire, and Lucinda stood a moment in the doorway with her warning unspoken and her hurt plain, and then she said, "Yes, in the morning. Good night, your grace." And the your grace, which she had not called him in weeks, told him that he had wounded her, and some sick part of him was glad of the wound, because a man in the grip of that particular fear takes a bitter comfort in wounding the thing he is afraid to love, as though by striking first he might prove he never cared, and so be safe. He was not safe. He lay awake the whole of that night as he had lain awake his first night in the house. Only then it had been wonder that kept him, and now it was ruin. And in the gray before dawn he heard, faint through the sleeping house, a sound he knew, for he had made a study of every kind of human sound, and it was the sound of a woman weeping alone and trying not to be heard, somewhere down the cold corridors, and he lay rigid and listened to it, and told himself it was the weeping of a woman found out. A schemer whose game had been seen through, and did not go to her, and it was in fact the weeping of a wife who had tried to warn her husband of her sister's malice, and had been turned from his door with a cold your grace, and who had gone away and understood at last that the man she had let herself love had gone back behind his wall and shut her out, and did not know why, and could not reach him, and wept for it alone in the dark rather than let the servants or her gloating sister hear. Cassandra heard it, though. Cassandra's room was nearer. Cassandra lay in the dark and heard her sister weep and smiled, and in the morning she and Julian took their leave, all false sisterly tenderness at the door, and Cassandra kissed Lucinda's cold cheek and murmured that she did so hope things would come right, in a voice pitched for Roderick to hear, and drove away south, leaving her lie behind her to do its work, well satisfied, certain she had at last found the means to bring low the sister she had spent her life unable to bear. And Roderick stood in his own doorway and watched the carriage go and felt the whole warm year of his marriage curdling to ice inside him, and turned, and went into his cold house, and began the 3 worst weeks of both their lives. The cold came back to Stormont, and it came from its master, and Roderick knew it and could not stop it, which was the particular horror of the weeks that followed. He had spent 5 years learning to freeze, and he found the old skill waiting in him like a language one does not forget, and he retreated into it and pulled the house's warmth down with him as a drowning man pulls down whatever he can reach. He was courteous. That was the cruelty of it. He never raised his voice, never accused, never gave Lucinda the honest quarrel that might have let her fight. He simply withdrew 1 degree at a time until the man who had read aloud by her fire and told her the history of his ring was gone, and in his place sat the Duke of Stormont, cold and correct, who inquired after her health at breakfast and did not meet her eyes. He stopped riding out with her. He took his dinner, more often than not, alone in the library on a tray, sending word he was occupied with the accounts. When they did sit together, he answered her in the short, flat sentences he had used the first week of their marriage, and he watched the bewilderment in her deepen into something worse, into a careful stillness that he recognized, with a stab of self-loathing that changed nothing, as the same stillness she had worn at the altar in the moment of her ruin. He was doing to her what Julian had done. He knew it. He could not stop. For the poison did its work in the dark, and in the dark it grew. Cassandra and Julian had gone at last, driven out finally by a cold from Roderick that even Cassandra's composure could not weather, but Cassandra had left her lie behind her like a coal in dry grass, and it smoldered. Every kindness Lucinda showed him now, Roderick read through the lens his sister-in-law had ground for him. When Lucinda looked at him with hurt and confusion, he told himself it was the frustration of a woman whose performance had stopped yielding its reward. When she tried, gently, again and again, to reach him, to ask what had changed, to bridge the widening cold, he heard Cassandra's voice. Every kindness she shows you is a performance. He was too proud to ask her outright. To ask would be to show her the wound, and he had sworn over Aline's grave that no woman would ever again see him bleed. So he suffered in silence and made her suffer in silence beside him, and Stormont, which had briefly been a home, became again a beautiful cold tomb, and Mrs. Pell, of all people, looked at her master across the ruin of it with an expression he could not meet. For the old housekeeper had come, over the long autumn and winter, to love the new duchess with the fierce loyalty of a proud woman won slowly and won wholly, and she watched Roderick freeze his wife by inches, and she was. Roderick saw, furious, and one gray afternoon in February, she forgot her place entirely and told him so. She found him in the library and she shut the door, which she had no right to do, and she stood before him with her keys in her 2 hands and her long face working, and she said, "I have kept this house for 30 years, and I have never once spoken to a master as I am about to speak to you, and you may turn me off for it and I will go, but I will say it first." Roderick set down his pen. "Say it then." "You are killing her." The old woman's voice cracked. "That good girl who dried out this dead house and gave it back its life and gave you back yours, and I have watched you take it all away from her these 3 weeks for a reason I cannot fathom, and I will not stand in the corridor and watch it and hold my tongue. I held my tongue with the first one. I saw how it was with the first one, how she was, how little she cared for you, and I said nothing, and it was wrong of me, and I have regretted it 5 years. I will not be silent twice. This one loves you. Do you hear me? I have served the great, and I know the false article from the true, and that girl loves you, and she does not know what she has done to earn your cold, and it is breaking her, and you are a fool, your grace, saving your presence, a great blind fool, and there. I have said it. Turn me off." Roderick did not turn her off. He sat very still in the winter light with the old woman's words going through him like a thaw wind through rotten ice, and he said at last, roughly, "Her sister told me she married me to spite Ravenscar, that she loves him still, that every kindness has been a performance." Mrs. Pell stared at him, and then she did a thing he had not seen her do in 30 years. She laughed, a single harsh, incredulous bark, and there were tears standing in her old eyes. "Her sister," she said. That painted, envious creature who sat at your table and could not keep the spite out of her face when she looked at all her sister had. And you believed her, you who see through everyone. You believed the one lie you wanted to be true because it let you go back into your dark where it's safe and nobody can hurt you. She shook her head slowly. I found the Duchess weeping in the linen room a week ago, sir, and do you know what she was weeping over? She would not tell me at first, but it came out. She was weeping because that sister of hers had cornered her the whole visit trying to make her run off with Ravenscar again, wanting her ruined, wanting her brought low, so the county would stop talking of the Duchess of Stormont and go back to talking of Cassandra. And your Duchess sent them both away with a flea in their ear and told the young man to his face that she would not cross the room for him if he were the last man in England, that she had married a better man than he could dream of being. And then she came and wept in my linen room because that better man had gone cold as the grave, and she did not know why. The old woman's voice dropped. She defended you. To the man she was supposed to be pining for, she defended you. And you have spent 3 weeks punishing her for a crime she committed in your sister-in-law's jealous mouth, and nowhere else on this earth. Roderick rose from his chair. He felt as a man feels who has been walking a long time in the dark shore of the ground and finds the ground was never there. Every cold, correct courtesy of the last 3 weeks turned over in his memory and showed its other face. Lucinda's hurt, which he had read as thwarted greed, was only hurt. Her patient reaching, which he had read as performance, was only love, offered again and again to a man freezing it in her hands. She had defended him. She had turned away the golden boy she was supposed to have wanted, and had come home to be met with ice, and had wept alone rather than reproach him. And he had done it. He, who prided himself on seeing through everyone, had been played by the crudest liar in 3 counties because the liar had offered him the one story his fear was starving to swallow. "Where is she?" he said. But the house, when he went through it calling her with a control that was cracking at every seam, gave back no answer, and it was the stammering Bootby, white-faced, who found him in the great hall and told him, in the clearest sentences the child had ever managed, that the Duchess had gone. A letter had come at noon. She had read it and gone very pale and called for the gig and driven out alone toward the village, and she had not taken a maid, and that had been 3 hours since, and it was coming on to snow. Roderick had the letter within a minute. She had left it, half crushed, upon her writing table, and he read it standing in her cold room, and the ice in his chest turned to something hotter and worse. It was from Cassandra. It was a masterpiece of its kind. It told Lucinda, in tones of sisterly anguish, that Julian had fallen into a black despair since the visit, that he was ill, that he raved of Lucinda, that only she could save him, that he waited at the inn at Stormont village and begged one meeting, one word, or he would do himself a harm. It was a trap and a clumsy one, and Roderick saw the whole shape of it at a glance, because he saw shapes. Cassandra had failed to break the marriage from within, and so she had baited her sister to a public inn to meet another woman's husband, so that the county, so hungry for the Duchess of Stormont's fall, might catch her there and destroy her, and Cassandra might have back the only thing she had ever wanted, which was to be the sister who had not been ruined. And Lucinda, who was too good, who had spent her life picking up what was broken exactly as Roderick had gone. Not for love of Julian. Roderick knew that now, knew it in his bones, 3 weeks too late. She had gone because a foolish, weak man might harm himself, and she could not carry that, because she was constitutionally unable to let a thing break if she might prevent it, even a worthless thing, even at the cost of walking into her enemy's trap. She had gone alone into the snow toward a public ruin, and she had gone straight from 3 weeks of her husband's cold, with no reason left to believe he would come after her, with every reason to believe he did not care. Roderick was in the stable yard before he had finished the thought, and he took the black hunter and no groom and no cloak worth the name, and he rode out of Stormont into the thickening snow with a fear in him that he had felt only once before in his life, and that had ended in freezing mud with a dead woman in his arms. He would not have it end so again. He set his teeth and put the horse at the white road and rode as though he could outride the last 3 weeks and the last 5 years both, and the snow came down over the moor and swallowed the towers of Stormont behind him, and somewhere ahead in the failing light, his wife was walking into a trap laid by her own sister, and the only man who could pull her out of it had spent 3 weeks giving her every reason to believe he would not come. The village was 4 miles. The light was going. He rode the 4 miles in something under half an hour that nearly killed the horse, and every yard of it he was composing, in the cold clear part of his mind that never entirely left him, the words he would say if he was in time, and discarding them because there were no words adequate, because the only thing adequate was to have not been a fool for 3 weeks, and that was past mending. He could not unmake the cold he had shown her. He could only, if the God he had stopped speaking to 5 years ago was merciful, reach the inn before the trap closed, and stand in front of her at last, as she had said no one in his life had ever stood in front of him. He bent lower over the horse's neck. The lights of Stormont village came up yellow and blurred through the falling snow, and the sign of the inn swung creaking over its door, and there were carriages in the yard, too many carriages, the carriages of the curious and the cruel, and Roderick understood that the trap had been well laid indeed, and that he was riding into the second public reckoning of Lucinda Fairfax's life, and that this time he did not mean to arrive too late. The inn's public room was full, and Roderick understood the fullness the moment he came through the door out of the snow, because a village inn does not fill with the gentry of 3 parishes on a February evening by chance. Cassandra had done her work thoroughly. She had let it be known, doubtless in a dozen careful whispers, that something worth seeing would occur at Stormont village that night, that the Duchess of Stormont, the plain twin who had risen so high, was to be seen in a compromising light, and the county had come out through the snow to watch, because the county had never forgiven Lucinda for rising, and would have driven miles further than this to see her fall. She stood in the middle of the room. Roderick took it all in through the door in a single freezing instant. Lucinda in her traveling cloak with her back very straight and her face white, and composed in the way he had learned to read as the face she wore over a mortal wound. Julian Ravenscar beside her, flushed with drink and self-pity, holding her wrist. Cassandra a little apart with her lovely face arranged into a performance of shocked sisterly grief that did not reach her glittering eyes. And around them in a loose greedy ring the faces of the county, lit by the fire and the tallow candles, avid, whispering, savoring. It was the church again. It was the altar again, the same scene staged a second time by the same hand, the ruin of Lucinda Fairfax offered up for the entertainment of people who had never once been kind to her. And this time Roderick did not come to it a stranger who had noticed a woman feed a dog. This time he came to it as her husband, and as a man who had spent 3 weeks helping her enemies by freezing her heart, and the shame of that was a spur in his side sharper than any the county could offer him. He did not know in the doorway what he had walked in upon. He learned it standing there, from the shape of the scene and the few words still hanging in the smoky air. Julian had been making a spectacle. He had drunk himself into a passion, and he was declaiming before the whole assembled county that Lucinda had come to him tonight, that she had never stopped loving him, that she had thrown herself over to a monster for spite and repented it, and would leave the cold Duke and come away with him now. And Cassandra stood by weeping her false tears and saying, "Oh, Julian, oh, my sister," in a voice pitched for the back of the room, and the trap was sprung and its jaws were closing. For it did not matter in the least what Lucinda had actually said or done. It mattered only that she was here, in a public inn, at night, alone, with another woman's husband holding her wrist and proclaiming her love before 40 witnesses. That was ruin. That was ruin as complete as the church had promised and failed to deliver, and the county had come to feast on it. And Lucinda was speaking. That was the thing that stopped Roderick in the doorway and held him one heartbeat longer before he moved. She was not weeping. She was not pleading. She had drawn her wrist from Julian's grip, and she was speaking to the room in a voice that shook and did not break, and Roderick heard the end of it as he came through the crowd. "And you may believe what you have come to believe," she was saying, "for I see you have all come a long way through the snow to believe it, and I will not give you the pleasure of watching me beg you not to. I did not come here for this man. I came because my sister wrote to me that he would harm himself, and I have never in my life been able to let a thing be hurt if I might prevent it, and she knows it, and she used it, as she has used it since we were children. I have nothing to be ashamed of in this room. I have been a faithful wife to a better man than any of you have troubled to know, and if that man never speaks to me again after tonight, if he believes what you have all come here to believe, I will still have been faithful to him because I did not marry him for spite and I did not marry him for his name. Whatever my sister has told you, whatever she has told him, I married him because. She stopped. Roderick had come through the last of the crowd and she saw him, and the words she had been about to say to a room full of her enemies died in her throat, because the one person in the world they had been meant for, though she had not known it, was standing before her, snow-melted and wild-eyed and having heard them. The room went very still. Roderick looked at his wife across 3 feet of smoky candle-lit air, and he was aware of the county watching, of Cassandra's face, of Julian swaying and blinking, of 40 pairs of avid eyes, and he found that he did not care for a single one of them, that the fear of showing his heart in public which had governed 5 years of his life had simply burned away in the ride through the snow and was gone, and what was left was very clear and very simple. "Finish it," he said to her low. "You married me because—" Lucinda's composure, which had withstood the whole cruel room, broke at last, not into weeping but into a kind of naked truth that was harder to witness. "I will not say it here," she whispered. "Not in front of them, not to be laughed at. I have been laughed at enough in this county to last my life." "Then let them laugh at me instead," said Roderick, and he turned deliberately to face the room, and he raised his voice, the cold, famous voice they had all been afraid of for 5 years, and he used it now for the first time in his life, not to keep the world at a distance, but to pull one person close in front of all of them. "You have come a long way through the snow," he said, "to see the Duchess of Stormont ruined. I will not send you home empty, for I know what you want, and I find tonight I no longer care to deny you your sport, only I mean to change its object. You want a spectacle. Here is one. I am the Duke of Stormont, whom you have called a murderer for 5 years, and I have let you call it, because the truth was not mine alone to tell, and I would not buy my own good name with a dead woman's. You may go on calling it, for all it will ever cost me. But you will not, from this night, say one word against my wife, for I am about to tell you exactly what she is, and I will call any man in this room to account who contradicts me." No one moved. Roderick had never in his life spoken so many words together in a public room, and the county, which had come to watch a woman broken, found itself instead pinned under the attention of the man it feared most, and did not dare to breathe. "This woman," he said, "came into my house out of the wreckage of a betrayal you all witnessed, and where a lesser creature would have wept and taken to her bed, she went to work. She dried a dead house. She warmed a cold one. She won the loyalty of servants who had served 3 dukes and never loved one, and she won it because she saw them, every one, the way she sees everything, the way none of you have ever troubled to see anyone. She learned the truth about my first marriage, a truth that would have handed her the means to shame me, and she has never breathed a word of it and never will, for she is not made as you are made. And when her own sister came into my house and tried to seduce her back to that man there for the express purpose of ruining her, so that this county might go back to admiring Cassandra instead of respecting Lucinda, my wife refused her. She refused him. She told him, I am reliably informed, that she would not cross a room for him if he were the last man in England. Roderick let that land. He watched Julian Ravenscar go gray. He watched Cassandra's false tears stop as though a tap had been turned. And then she came home to me, and I, who am the greatest fool in this room and possibly in this county, met her with coldness, because I too had believed her sister's lie, because I had spent 5 years so certain that I was not a thing any good woman could love that, when a liar came to tell me my wife did not love me, I swallowed it whole, being starved for it. I froze her heart for 3 weeks. If she is ruined tonight, the ruin began at my hearth and not at this inn, and the shame of it is mine and not hers, and I have ridden 4 miles through a snowstorm to stand in this room and say so, in front of every one of you, so that there can be no whispering afterward about what the Duke of Stormont does or does not believe about his wife. I believe she is the best soul in this county. I believe I did not deserve her and do not, and mean to spend my life trying. And I believe, he turned back to Lucinda, and his voice changed, and the whole avid room heard it change, that a woman who defended me to the man she was supposed to love, who wept alone rather than reproach me for my cruelty, who walked into her sister's trap tonight rather than let even a worthless man come to harm, is a woman I have loved since the first hour I saw her, before ever I offered for her, and have been too great a coward to tell. So I am telling you now, Lucinda, here, where you were meant to be broken, because you said once that no one in my whole life had ever stood in front of me, and you were right. And I mean to stand in front of you now, for as long as I live, whatever it costs, before anyone. The room did not laugh. Roderick had braced for it in some corner of himself, the county's cruel laughter, and it did not come, because there are moments even a cruel room cannot laugh at, and this was one. And the silence held, and into it Lucinda Fairfax looked at her husband with her white, composed face at last coming apart, and the tears she had refused the county from the moment she entered the room spilled over, and she said, in a voice that everyone heard and that she no longer cared that everyone heard, "I married you because you were the only person who ever looked at me and saw me and not my sister. In a church full of people who thought me plain, you looked at me. And I have loved you since Michaelmas, Roderick, since the night of the East Wing, and I did not say it because I thought you could not want the plain twin, the jilted one, the bargain you made out of pity, and I have been as great a coward as you. And oh, you dreadful man, you have made me weep in front of the whole county after all." "Then let it be the last time," said Roderick, and he crossed the last of the distance between them, and he did not kiss her, not there, not to be watched, for some things were not the county's to have. But he took both her cold hands in his, and he raised them to his lips, one and then the other, in front of every enemy she had ever had, and it was somehow more than any kiss, and the county saw the Duke of Stormont bow his dark head over his wife's hands as though she were the Queen of England, and knew that it had come out through the snow to see a ruin, and had witnessed instead a devotion it would be telling of, in far different tones, for the next 50 years. There remained the matter of Cassandra, and the county, having been denied the ruin it came for, turned as a single hungry animal to find some other object for the appetite the evening had roused in it, and found one ready to hand, and Roderick did nothing to prevent it, because there is a justice that a man need only step aside to let fall. For the county was not stupid, only cruel, and cruelty served with a fresh direction is quick to reason. It had come to the inn on Cassandra's whispered promise of a spectacle. It had been told that the Duchess of Stormont would be caught in disgrace with another woman's husband. And it had seen instead a woman falsely lured, a weak man drunk and raving, and a duke lay bare a scheme with names and motives in it. And the room, turning the evening over as Roderick released Lucinda's hands and stood with his arm about her, began to understand precisely who had summoned it out into the snow, and why, and what it had been made into. It had been made into the instrument of a jealous woman's spite. The county did not mind being cruel, but it minded very much being used, and it minded most of all being made to look a fool, and it looked around now for the person who had done all three to it, and there she stood. Cassandra had not fled. That was her undoing, though flight would only have delayed it. She had stayed, certain to the last that her beauty and her tears would carry the room as they had carried every room of her life, and she found now, turning her lovely tear-stained face from one neighbor to the next in search of the sympathy that had never once failed her, that it had failed her at last wholly, and that the faces she turned to were no longer admiring but appalled, and then cold, and then, worst of all, amused, for the county had grasped the full comedy of it. That Cassandra Fairfax had stolen her sister's groom at an altar to be the sister everyone admired, and had thrown away a viscount and years of scheming, and had come at last to a snowbound inn to complete her sister's ruin, and had succeeded only in crowning her sister's glory, and unmasking her own black heart before every person whose opinion she had spent her life courting. It was Julian who broke first, as weak men do, turning on his wife to save himself, crying out that it was Cassandra's doing all of it, that she had written the letter, that she had summoned the county, that she had schemed the whole of it and he had been her tool. And the county heard the Viscount confirm with his own drunken mouth every word the Duke had spoken. And Roderick watched Cassandra Fairfax's beautiful face come apart at last, not into the pretty grief she had spent so freely all evening, but into the true and ugly thing beneath it, the naked fury of a woman who has staked everything on being wanted and finds herself, in a room full of the people she most wished to dazzle, despised. She turned to Lucinda. It was the last card in her hand, and she played it with the desperation of the ruined, sweeping toward her sister with her arms half out, crying that Lucinda must help her, must speak for her, that they were sisters, twins, that Lucinda had always been the good one and must be good now, must save her. And Roderick felt his wife go still against his arm, and he did not speak, because this was Lucinda's to answer and no one else's. And he had sworn a quarter of an hour ago to stand in front of her before all the world, but he understood the difference between standing in front of a woman and standing in her place, and he held his tongue and let her rise to her full height beside him. Lucinda looked at her sister for a long moment, and Roderick, who could read her face as he could read no other, saw the whole of their childhood pass across it, the long years of being the shadow, the mother's cold eye, the invisible girl who had made a virtue of watching because no one watched her, and the altar and the theft, and the letter that had lured her here tonight to be destroyed. He braced for her anger. She had earned her anger. The whole room, having been so cruel so long, would have relished her cruelty now, and forgiven her any measure of it, and Cassandra had earned every ounce. Lucinda did not give it. "I will not have you turned out into the snow tonight, Cassandra," she said quietly, "for you are my sister, and I am not made as you are made, and I find I cannot unmake myself even for the pleasure of watching you suffer, though God knows you have laid the temptation thick enough. You may have a room here and money to take you home in the morning, but you will not come to Stormont again. You have tried 3 times now to break what I have built, at the altar and in my home and in this room, and I have forgiven the first 2, and I forgive this one, but I will not offer you a 4th occasion. Go home. Live quietly if you are capable of it. Learn to want something you have not stolen. And know that the sister you spent your life eclipsing pities you tonight, truly and without pleasure, which I think will gall you worse than any hatred, and which is the only revenge I will ever take, because it is the only one I have the stomach for." It was, Roderick thought, watching, the most complete humbling he had ever witnessed, and not one word of it cruel, and the county thought so too, and something shifted in the room in that moment that would follow both sisters the rest of their lives. For the county went home that night and told the story, as Roderick had known it would, but it told a story its teller had not planned. It told of the false twin unmasked and the true one vindicated, of a scheming beauty brought low by her own snare, and a gentle wronged woman who had answered spite with mercy before the eyes of 40 witnesses. Cassandra had wanted, her whole life, to be the sister who was talked of. She had her wish at last, and would have it for years, and every telling of it would be a nail, for she was talked of now as the woman who had stolen a groom and lost him, who had schemed and been exposed, whose disgraced sister had risen to a duchess's coronet, and then, at the height of it, had pitied her in public. She went south the next morning in a hired gig with a husband who despised her and whom she despised, into a marriage begun in theft and soured past saving, and the county's talk followed her the whole way, and Roderick, when he heard of it in the weeks after, felt no triumph, only the flat quiet of a debt paid by no hand of his. Julian Ravenscar he did not think of again, and that, he reflected, was perhaps the truest measure of how little the man had ever been worth the fearing. The golden boy who had thrown away a good woman at an altar and had spent one drunken evening trying to snatch her back once another man had shown him her worth, went south with his wife into the small cold marriage they had built for each other, and passed out of the story of Stormont as such men pass out of every story, unmourned, a lesson rather than a person, a coin thrown away that had taught 2 people, by its throwing, the value of what remained. They rode home from the inn together in the deep of that night, Roderick and Lucinda, in a hired chaise with the Black Hunter tied behind, for the horse was too spent to carry them and Roderick would not leave it, and the snow had stopped and the moor lay white and enormous and silent under a sky scoured clear to the stars, and for a long while neither of them spoke, because there was too much to say and no need any longer to hurry it. Lucinda's head had come to rest against his shoulder. He had put his arm about her. These were small things and they were the whole world. "You said it in front of all of them," she said at last, wonderingly into the dark. "You who have not let a soul see your heart in 5 years. You stood in that room and you told the whole county you loved me." "I found I had stopped being able to think of a reason not to," said Roderick. "I spent 5 years learning to keep the world at a distance because Eleanor taught me what it cost to let it close, and I was so very sure of the lesson. And then a woman fed a stray dog at an assembly and did not know I saw, and I have been unlearning it ever since, one wall at a time, and tonight I found there were no walls left, and it was a great relief, like setting down a thing I had carried so long I had forgotten it was heavy." He paused. "I am sorry for the 3 weeks. I will be sorry for them a long time. I froze you because a liar told me the thing I was most afraid to hear, and rather than ask you, rather than trust the truth of a single hour we had spent together, I believed her, because it let me go back into the dark where nothing could reach me. It was cowardice. It nearly cost me everything. It cost you 3 weeks of grief you had done nothing to earn, and if I live to be 100, I do not think I will forgive myself the linen room, where Mrs. Pell found you weeping, and where you defended me even in your weeping." "You knew about the linen room?" "Mrs. Pell told me. She shut the library door on me this afternoon and called me a great blind fool to my face, and threatened to leave, and she was entirely right, and I have doubled her wages and mean to leave her a legacy that will make her the richest housekeeper in England, for she saved us both today, and neither of us will ever tell her so plainly, for she would not know where to put herself." Lucinda laughed at that, a real laugh, the first he had heard from her in 3 weeks, and the sound of it went through the cold chaise like a fire lit, and Roderick understood that he would spend the rest of his life arranging to cause that sound, and that it was as worthy a way to spend a life as any he had ever heard of. He drew her closer. Above the white moor the stars burned in their thousands, and Stormont rose ahead of them out of the dark, its windows. He saw with something turning over in his chest. All lit, everyone, for Mrs. Pell had ordered the whole house lit against their coming home, the dead house that his wife had brought back to life, blazing now across the snow like a great ship on a still sea, waiting for them, warm. They came home to a lit house past midnight, and Mrs. Pell was waiting in the great hall with her keys and her long face and her eyes suspiciously bright, and she took one look at the two of them coming through the door together, snow-dusted and worn and unmistakably reconciled, and she did not say a word, only pressed her lips very hard together and dropped a curtsy deeper than any she had given in 30 years, and turned quickly away to see about hot possets before either of them could see what was on her face. Roderick let her go. Some kinds of love do not care to be looked at while they do their work, and he had learned enough of love in one long night to know the courtesy of not looking. The kiss they had not given each other at the altar, nor in the church, nor at the inn before the county's eyes. They gave at last that night at the top of the great stair, with the lit house quiet around them and no one to see. And Roderick found that a thing withheld so long and given at last in its right time and place was worth every hour of the withholding. What followed the story does not tell, for it belonged to the two of them and to no other soul, and the doors of Stormont, which had stood so long closed upon a cold and grieving house, closed that night upon a warm one and drew the veil kindly over its master and mistress, and the tale goes on to morning. The mornings of Stormont were different after that, and the change was not sudden and was not undone, which is how one knows a true change from a false dawn. Roderick woke, those first weeks, with a kind of astonishment that did not fade, to find the other side of the great bed warm, to find that the woman he had married in ashes was there in the gray light with her dark hair loose upon the pillow and her face, in sleep, unguarded and dear, and that this was his life now, not a thing borrowed or bargained but simply his, given and received and meant to last. He was not a man who had ever expected happiness, having decided early that it was not among the things allotted to him, and he approached his own with the careful wonder of a man handling a thing he cannot quite believe he is permitted to keep. Lucinda teased him for it. "You look at me every morning," she told him, "as though you expect me to have vanished in the night." "I do," he admitted. "I spent 5 years alone. I am learning to trust the mornings. Give me time." "I mean to give you 50 years," she said, "at the least." And he found that the prospect, which a year before would have seemed to him a sentence, seemed now the whole of everything he had ever wanted, laid out ahead of them across the moor like a lit road. The county came round, as the county always does, being a weather vane and not a compass. Where it had once whispered of cold Stormont and his frozen wife, it spoke now, with the shameless amnesia of society, of the great love match at the keep, of the duke who had rescued a jilted bride from the very altar and had grown to worship her, of the Duchess of Stormont who had been so cruelly wronged and had risen so high, and had shown such mercy to the sister who wronged her. They had it half right, which for the county was a marvel. And Roderick, who might once have despised them for the turning, found he no longer had the energy to spare for despising anyone, being fully occupied with the unfamiliar and pleasant labor of being happy. He let the truth about Alina rest. He had told it to Lucinda in the snow of the East Wing, and Lucinda knew, and that was the only knowing that had ever mattered, and the dead woman could keep her secret and her honor both, for Roderick no longer needed the county to think well of him. He had one person who thought well of him, who had seen him entire and had not turned away, and one such person, he had discovered, was worth more than the good opinion of the whole world, and made the whole world's opinion a small and distant weather. The East Wing they opened and aired and made new. It had been a tomb. Lucinda would not let it stay one. She would not use it herself, would not sleep where the first Duchess had, having too much delicacy for that, but she would not let it moulder either, and so between them they made it over into other things. A nursery of light-filled rooms against the years to come, a library added to Roderick's own, a music room where in later years the house would fill with sound. And the falcon's signet that Roderick had put upon Lucinda's finger at the altar because he had no proper ring, he did not take back. He had a wedding ring made for her in the spring, a slender band of gold, and he gave it to her properly, on one knee in the long gallery among the tapestries she had saved, and asked her, absurdly, a year married, to marry him, meaning it this time not as a rescue nor a bargain but as the plainest truth of his heart. And she wept and laughed and said yes a second time, and wore the gold band on her finger and the black signet on a chain about her neck, over her heart always, the ring of ashes and the ring of gold, the marriage that had begun in ruin and the love it had grown into, kept together, because she said, and he agreed, that one ought never to forget the ashes, for they were the ground the whole flowering had grown from. Mrs. Pell lived long, and grew, in her stern way, to rule the nursery as she had ruled the presses, and was buried in the end in the churchyard at Stormont with a stone the Duke paid for that named her, against all custom, not merely as a servant but as a friend of the house, which scandalized the county and delighted the Duchess, and would have flustered the old woman past all bearing had she lived to read it. The stammering bootboy grew into a footman and then a steward and served the house all his life and named his first son Roderick, and never knew, for they did not tell him, that the Duke had wept, briefly and privately, on hearing of it. And Cassandra in the South, in her cold, soured marriage, grew old being talked of in exactly the way she had least wished, and never mended, and never came again to Stormont. And Lucinda wrote to her twice a year all the same, kind letters that went unanswered, because Lucinda was not made in a way that could stop, and Roderick let her write them and never said a word against it, having learned that the mercy in his wife which had once seemed to him a danger, the same mercy that had walked her into the trap at the inn, was in truth the finest thing about her and the very thing he had first loved, glimpsed across a terrace as she fed a stray dog she thought no one saw, and that a man does not love a woman for her softness and then ask her to be hard. He shields the softness and is glad of it and stands in front of it before all the world for as long as he lives. which he did. That was the shape of the years, the long good years that followed the one hard one, and if there was a truer measure of a life than the shape of its years, no one at Stormont ever found it. The most feared man in 3 counties became, in the fullness of time, its most envied, for the whole country could not help but see, the thing that had happened at Stormont, that a marriage begun in the coldest ashes any of them had ever witnessed had turned into a warmth that put their own careful matches to shame. They had watched a bride broken at an altar. They had watched a feared duke claim her out of pity, or so they had thought, and had settled in to see the cold house freeze another wife. And they had been made to watch, instead, over the slow turning years, a devotion so plain and so unhidden that even the most cynical drawing-room in the county fell silent before it. The duke who would cross a room to bring his duchess a shawl, who read to her by the fire every winter evening of their lives and grew, at last, quite good at it, who was seen at more than 60 to take his wife's hand in a crowded room and raise it to his lips exactly as he had done once at a snowbound inn, as though she were still and always the greatest treasure ever granted to an undeserving man. Lucinda Fairfax had gone to an altar as the plain twin, the overlooked one, the shadow of her dazzling sister, and had been broken there before all the world by the 2 people who ought most to have loved her. And she had risen from that ruin to become the beloved Duchess of Stormont, cherished beyond the telling of it by a man the whole world had feared and no one had ever known, a man who had watched her once across a crowded church and seen, where everyone else saw a shadow, the only light he had ever wanted. She never doubted in all the long years that she was loved. He had cured her of doubting it that night at the inn before the county, and had gone on curing her of it every day after, in 1,000 small, unremarkable acts across the length of their lives, because he had learned, kneeling once in freezing mud and standing once in a crowded inn, that love unspoken is only a wall by another name, and he was done forever with walls. And so the broken bride was cherished, and the faithless twin was humbled, and the feared duke was known at last, and the great house of Stormont, which had grieved so long, forgot how to grieve. And on winter evenings, when the snow came down over the moor as it had come down the night he rode 4 miles to stand in front of her before all the world, the Duke of Stormont sat by his fire with his wife's head against his shoulder, and the book fallen forgotten in his lap, and thought, as a man thinks who has been given more than he ever dared ask, that he had come to a wedding once meaning only to be seen, and had been, instead, by the one person he had never known he was waiting for, and had spent the rest of his life being glad of it. The fire burned. The house was warm. She was there. It was, he had long since stopped being astonished to find, enough. It was, in fact, everything. And outside the lit windows the snow fell soft and endless over Stormont and covered the old cold years and did not trouble them at all.